Please let me introduce our guest for today, and it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce Nick Bibby, who has kindly agreed to give up his afternoon and talk to us and share his wealth of experience with us today. Nick directs the Scottish Policy and Research Exchange, which helps develop and strengthen links between academics and policy professionals. Prior to that, he worked for the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. He began his career in political journalism before living overseas for a few years and returning to Scotland to work in higher education and now SPRE.
Thanks very much, Milka, and thank you again for the invite to speak today. I'm going to run through a few slides, and we're going to be talking about how you might write a policy brief and some of the things you might want to consider in writing that. Normally when I give on this presentation, I pick up on 2 or 3 different types of communication tools that you might use. I'm going to focus on policy briefs today, but apologies in advance if I sort of ramble off a bit and say, oh, you might want to think about this, or you might want to consider this. Policy briefs are a useful tool, but they are one tool among many, and I'll pick that out in my talk. If you have questions as I'm talking, please do just pop them in the chat and I'll pick those up at the end. If there's something more urgent, or if there's something I say that just makes no sense at all, which is entirely possible, just unmute yourself and shout out, and we'll deal with that then and there. I'm always tempted to say at this point, if there is a fire alarm, you should definitely leave the building. But it's now so long since we've been in actual physical rooms, I'm not sure that joke works anymore. But there we are. That's obviously a picture of the Scottish Parliament there on that front slide. SPRE, the organisation I run, focuses on the Scottish political environment, the Scottish policy landscape. But a lot of what I'm going to say today, in fact, pretty much everything, would apply to engaging with any other policy actor as well. One thing I should make clear kind of before we get into this is that it's very easy when we talk about policy to immediately think in terms of the central bodies of policy making. So the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. It is really important to understand that there's a lot of life beyond that. So there are local authorities, there are public bodies. It's worth familiarizing yourself with the different tiers of government and who has responsibility for which of those. I'm conscious that Nicola McEwen was one of your earlier speakers in this series. I don't know if Nicola got into that, obviously. Territorial politics and devolution is her field. So I won't go into that, but if she was focusing on a different area, then I'm very happy to pick up in questions how you might think about the different tiers of government and which agency it is that you need to connect with. So I've called this Talking with Policymakers, but we'll be focusing today, as I mentioned, on policy briefs in particular. So when you're thinking about communicating information to a policy audience, there are a huge number of tools that you might want to use to communicate. I mean, I just put a section from there. And often we don't even think of these things as tools. We just think of them as things that are there, and often just start off with a sort of, oh, well, okay, I need to get in touch with this person now. I'll send them an email. I'll pick up the telephone. Oh, should we be doing some press work? Oh, do we need to write a report? Oh, so-and-so is quite active on Twitter. Why don't we get them to retweet it? And one of the things I want you to take away from this talk is an understanding that all of those tools come with a cost and all of them are appropriate in different situations. And a policy brief is something you might use in quite particular situations. It shouldn't be something that you just kind of use by default because you think, oh, well, this is how to connect with policymakers. It's not necessarily the easiest route in as a starting point. It might be, but we can look at some of the variables on that. So you've got some images up there of different communication tools. and we could put up another dozen fairly easily. But what are some of the issues you might want to take into account there when you're thinking about which tool to use? The first thing is, don't overcomplicate things. Policy professionals are really time poor and are driven by very immediate considerations usually. So there's not a lot of time for long-term thinking, even in units that are dedicated to strategy. Actually, they tend to have to focus on pretty immediate things. And so actually using very clever and creative tools it can often backfire. So you go with what you know works. And one of the attractions of a policy brief as a format is that people are accustomed to getting them. So they already know who works. If one drops on their computer, they know how to respond to it. Whereas if you send them an email saying, we've captured the findings of our research in this short 25-minute film, there's not an obvious place for that to fit into their day. So use things that have worked, that there is a reason they use and a reason that they work. Nothing is perfect. Any communication tool you use will have weaknesses and strengths. I think it's the next slide. We'll look a bit about how you balance some of those off. But most typically, the thing you're balancing there is the balance between the needs of your message, and we'll unpack that term in just a moment, but essentially what you need to say and the needs of your audience, the person who's wanting to read it. Now, most typically for this kind of engagement, academics will want to go into a lot more detail and are concerned to express the nuance of a particular piece of research, or to caveat their understanding on a topic in particular ways. But the audience they're communicating with, as I've mentioned, is time poor. So whilst the ideal tool for you to communicate with that audience might be a journal article or might be a book, the chances of that being picked up by a policy audience are very slim. So any tool that you choose to use is always going to be a balance between those two demands. The final point on this really is to start small. I'm going to show you a couple of examples actually of evidence briefs later on. And the thing that's quite striking about them is how short they are. Yeah, that they're really quite simple. They're easy to engage with, and literally without reading it, you can look at them and some information jumps out. There's a little picture of an infographic there, which I would actually argue is too much information on there. But you want things that are immediately arresting, because people can always come back and ask for more information. Yeah, if the first thing you know when you open a document or open an email is, there is a thing straight in front of me that tells me why this is useful. Okay, I'll now digest a couple of paragraphs of this. All right, I now understand that this is something that will help me with something I'm working on at the moment. So now I can ask for more information. And that's the process that you're wanting people to work through. So start small. It's much easier to add further information subsequently. The thing I would stress, and this is quite important when we're looking at the information I'm going to be giving you today, a lot of this is predicated on the assumption that you have not previously had significant contact with the person you're talking to. If they have originally contacted you and commissioned you, you would approach this process in a very different way. Then you have an opportunity to go into a lot more detail from the outset, because that's what they've asked for. So a lot of my comments today are predicated on the idea that you're using a policy brief as a tool to get somebody's attention or to spark their interest in a particular topic. So that may not always be the case. And again, we can pick up on some of that in questions if that's useful. So let me start off by unpacking that distinction between message and audience. Now, some of you will be aware this is getting a bit into communications theory, but it is a useful way of approaching this process of producing a policy brief. Remember, you're writing for a non-academic audience. You're writing for probably a professional who has an interest in this topic, but it is not an academic interest. And so there are a number of things that you need to think about. Generally speaking, I would suggest that you try and spend at least a day thinking through, ideally talking to colleagues and working through the questions of what is your message and who is your audience. I mean, ideally you would spend more on that, but you know, there are practicalities. What I would absolutely not suggest you do is just fire straight in and start writing a policy brief. The decisions around what your message is usually the starting point. Yeah, so a message is just what do you want to say. Now, at first that sounds really obvious until you start playing around with audience as well. Because what you want to say needs to be the thing that your audience wants to hear. And so you'll iterate back and forth between those two things, trying to think in terms of, okay, well, how do I make this as relevant to my audience as possible? How does my audience usually learn? What are their priorities? What motivates them? What is it within this body of knowledge that I've got to share that speaks directly to that need? How does it speak to a policy consideration? What are the key points? What is the piece of information or the piece of analysis that I have to get across? What's at the absolute heart of everything within this exercise? Yeah, and so you go back and forth between these two things over and over again. Yeah, and think in terms of what you're communicating as a device, and to break that down. Yeah, so rather than saying our conclusions were, it's like, well, which conclusion? You know, which one speaks to the needs of the policymaker with whom you're trying to communicate? Avoid talking around the topic. It's often a real temptation to give more information, to extrapolate out from what it is you're trying to say. But it can be useful to provide a bit of context to help provide that hook of this is how it speaks to a policy question. So a policy brief is going to be focused on a very particular question usually, or a very particular topic. Policy questions are very different from research questions. The defining characteristic of a policy question is that any answer to it could be implemented. So that it solicits something that is implementable in the world. Ideas that aren't implementable for whatever reason aren't policy offerings, however brilliant they might be. If implementing them would bankrupt the Treasury or cause riots on the streets, or for that matter, split the party that you're asking to implement it, or cost a huge amount of political capital. All of those are realities. So you think about how does what we say speak to a policy audience who will be thinking about all of those things. But as I say, spend some time thinking through what is the message, what am I actually trying to say, what do I want the reader, in this case, to know or understand that they do not currently know or understand. And to answer that question, you're going to be thinking quite a lot about your audience and understanding what their interests are and what motivates them. So having thought through those two things quite a lot, that will help you determine the medium that you're going to use. Now that sentence I've pulled out in bold, I'll circulate these slides, by the way, so don't worry about getting this down. But that sentence that I pulled out in bold there is really the core of any type of communication, but in this case of communicating with policy professionals. So the tool that you use should allow you to say what you want to say in a way that allows your audience to understand it. Now, you can apply that principle to the type of language that you use, the way you use graphics, the accessibility of the document that you use, even the format of the document that you use, the length of the brief that you write, the way you break it up, the way you use subheadings. But when you're editing kind of anywhere beyond academia, often actually, but the question that you traditionally ask yourself is, does this help the reader understand? And so in approaching something like this, you would think very much in those terms. Yeah, so everything that you put into a policy brief, I'll take you on to look at what one looks like in just a moment. Everything that you put in to your policy brief has to get over that hurdle. Does it help your reader understand the thing that I want them to understand? So you've taken time to decide what that thing is. Does everything that goes in help them understand that, help them appreciate better what it is that you're saying? And if it doesn't, take it out. And that can often mean getting rid of things that you might feel are quite important. So it might mean, for example, not giving some or not giving much information on who funded a piece of research. Now, often funders are very keen that they should be there, but to be honest, it doesn't help an audience understand. I shall leave it up to you as to how you resolve that particular political battle. But it's, that should be the standard by which you're measuring everything you do. So I just want to unpick quickly that question of audience. Yeah, so this in many ways will determine more or less everything you put into, in this case, a policy brief, but also that would go into any other form of communication. So I've just set out a few questions here, which might be useful and might start you on that process of thinking about what it is that's going to go into your policy brief. So who is your audience and what do you know about them? Generally speaking, you want to try and keep that audience as narrow as possible. Yeah, so often you're thinking, oh, our audience should be other scholars, stakeholders, the general public, policymakers, journalists. No, try and get it as narrow as possible. So you're speaking to the particular interests of one group. Sometimes we do this exercise and we get people to think of a particular individual. Yeah, who is it that you're writing this for? And you target all of your language at that person, all of the points you're making at that person. It can be a useful intellectual exercise. But the more you can know about your audience, the better. So some of the things that you might try and find out about that audience: what motivates them, what interests them, what do they need? Yeah, so both what motivates them, if you like, in their professional life, what is their job that they wanted to do, but also what motivates them personally. That often people are doing a particular job because they're passionate about one aspect of that, or they might be under pressure to deliver in a particular area. So there's things like that you can think about. But the more you can understand about what do they need, what is the information I'm providing, how does it help them? Are they going to see this and think, oh, that's really useful, I'm working on that at the moment? Or are they going to look at it and say, oh, that's interesting, okay, yeah, I'll look at that when I've got a minute, and it vanishes into the depths of their email inbox. So those are some of the questions that you might want to answer. How does your reader usually receive information? How do they learn? Now, often it's difficult to find something like that out. You can make certain assumptions. The fact you're using a policy brief as a tool, as I mentioned, it's a common tool, so people won't be startled by that. Yeah, there's a really, I should have dug the article out, actually. There's a really good article by Richard Freeman at Edinburgh, where he starts off with an interesting question of what do civil servants do, but rather than seeing it through the usual prisms of, oh, they develop strategy, they engage stakeholders, that kind of language. He says, well, what they do is they read reports, write reports, and have meetings. Now, if we look at the entire structure of government through that prism or those prisms, then you understand things in slightly different ways. So how do they receive information? They receive information through reports for the most part. But the more condensed you can make that information, the better. It might be useful for me to mention that the journey that any knowledge you share, let's say for the moment a government civil servant, just because it's the most obvious model, the journey that knowledge will go on in the best of all possible worlds. So you boil your 3-year study down to a 2 or 3 page policy brief. And let's say that then goes into it, that sits on the desk of a government analyst, so analysts, so researchers in government. And they look at it and think, oh, this is really useful. This will help with a given aspect of the government's agenda. Okay, they then take that and they boil it down to maybe half a page. It goes off to a policy team. A policy team says, oh, this is great. Yeah, this is very useful. This is just what I'm looking for at the moment. They take it, they boil it down to maybe a couple of paragraphs. It goes to a minister's private office, or it's boiled down again now to 3 bullet points, just on the political implications usually of what this means. And based on those 3 bullet points, a decision maker will decide something. So the process of compression is extraordinary. So when we think about how do people receive information and how do they learn, they receive it really briefly, really quickly. So have that awareness of who's going to be looking at something. For example, if you are communicating with government analysts, they will be interested in methodology, but they won't be that interested. So often when we're writing for an academic audience, we might spend a lot of time talking about methodology. In this audience, much less so. Which picks up that next question, actually. Why should they be interested in your message? In many ways, that would tend to be my starting point. So you start off by saying, this is why it matters. And that should be why it matters to policy. So you want to contextualize anything you're saying in a policy setting. And then just very practical things. When and where is the best time to connect with somebody? It's really easy to lose sight of the fact that government and other policy institutions are made up of people. So when is the best time to connect with them? Right? It's unlikely to be 4:30 on a Friday. So if you've spent all week working on something and think, oh, I'll just send it off now, chances are that's not the right time to do it. Wait till 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. Where is the best time to engage with someone? I mean, whether that's in digital space or in real space, thinking through where is an appropriate point of connection for this person. Where will they be looking for information like this? Can help address all sorts of questions. So, as I say, those are some of the questions you might want to think about when you're looking at audience. I haven't prepared a slide like this on message, although again, we might want to chat about that in our questions if we can. So the process of writing a policy brief, the first thing to notice is that they are brief, right? They're very short. Now, I mentioned earlier on that if something's been commissioned from you, that's slightly different. So there you'd have a lot more flexibility, and what you'd write would look far more like a substantial report. The assumption here is that you are producing something to send off to a few stakeholders or to make available to them in one way or another. I said they're 2 or 4 pages. To be honest, it's 2. If you are producing a regular series of policy briefs, then you might make them as long as 4. But generally speaking, I would aim to get it down to 2. You want to make it as easy and as accessible as possible. One always looks a bit kind of flimsy, but 2 pages I think is quite strong. That requires a lot of discipline, but it can also require a lot of creativity. I'll show you, as I say, some evidence briefs in a bit, and you'll see how people have used the space on the page. So they haven't just treated it as a Word document full of text. They've used all sorts of different things, and it's worth thinking through how you can use that space in imaginative ways. There are much more efficient ways of communicating information than what's termed running text. So just regular text in regular paragraphs. But as much as possible, 2 to 4 pages, using a professional style, recognizing the fact that people you're dealing with are also professionals. They don't approach problems like academics, so you want to use straightforward language, but you shouldn't in any way use patronizing language. So recognize the professionalism of the people that you're dealing with. The second point is that they are policy briefs. The focus of their focus should be on a policy question. So again, it often doesn't work quite like this, but just for the sake of neatness, let's assume that you're producing a policy brief that's drawing out of a particular study. It may well be that the most interesting finding of that study from a policy perspective is not the most interesting finding from an academic perspective. In fact, that is routinely the case. So you want to think in terms of, well, what policy question might this address? How might I identify a question that I know is live in the minds of policymakers at the moment? Now, there's a number of ways of doing that. You can do it just by reading the press, although often by the time political stories are in the media, a lot of the policy decisions have already been made. It's by that point just a case of winning the politics. Not always, of course, but that's sometimes the case. So other places you might want to look, you could look at, we just had an election, so you could look at the manifestos of political parties to see what issues they're addressing, and that might help you think, well, what, in my array of findings, are the topics that will be most relevant to a policy professional. You could look at current parliamentary or government inquiries. That's obviously a good way of seeing what policy makers are interested in at the moment. As I happen, SPRE runs a service. It's free. You can sign up for, and we'll send you a weekly roundup of all parliamentary and government inquiries going on in all 4 of the UK's governments and parliaments. But there are other sources of that information as well. But again, you treat it as a way of sort of question spotting. Another approach, depending on the field you're working in, you might want to talk to NGOs. They're very good at reading the policy agenda and getting a sense of what's coming up over the next few months or the next couple of years. So that might be trade associations, trade unions, charities and other third sector organizations, and so on. Just seeing there's so identifying what the topic is that you're addressing will help provide a focus for the brief, and that part of that exercise in kind of figuring out a message will be you going through this process. Yeah, so what topic is it that we're actually addressing? Not a topic that is necessarily at the top of your mind. Yeah, it might be something that you care about, but then you have to be ruthless about it and say, is this of interest to policymakers at the moment? No, it isn't. Let's talk about something else. Yeah, so there's a degree of kind of intellectual ruthlessness there. Often it's a case of killing off what may seem to be important and well, killing it off, but saving it for another day, and focusing on what you know there's an audience for. The final point I'd make here, and this may seem self-evident, but you'd be surprised how rarely or how often it doesn't happen. Provide evidence that relates to the problem. Hopefully that is self-evident, but then the conclusions you draw should relate to that evidence. It is surprisingly common for people, for example, to set out the evidence from a particular study and then draw conclusions based on a much wider body of knowledge, or I have to say quite frequently, just the author's own opinion. And I don't mean a scholarly opinion, I mean just opinions about the evils of whatever the government happens to be doing. If you're writing a policy brief grounded on a body of evidence, make sure that the evidence you're providing and any conclusions you're drawing relate to each other, but also make that explicit. So really draw out, because of this, therefore this. So with all of that, what are we now? Getting on for half an hour into this, what does a policy brief look like? So the most important part of the whole brief is the exec summary, which will take up about 10% of the length of the whole paper. It is usually the last thing you write. So you might put something in that space just as a holder, but you produce the whole document and then think, okay, now if I condense this down to just a few sentences, what is it that I'm actually saying? And that's where you put in that absolute grabber to get people's attention. There's then, separate to that, an introduction. And so in that, you set out a bit of context. Why does it matter? What is it about what you're saying that's new? Right? Why is it interesting? Why should it be relevant to the reader? I mean, I said there about creating a sense of curiosity. I think that's important. Different people approach this in different ways. But I think by the time somebody has read the introduction, they should know that this is for them, and they should know that this is relevant to something they're working on at the moment. This is often the most challenging part to write. Methodology and what I would term the other sort of paraphernalia of research is important, but only briefly. So, there are things you might want to say there just to make clear to any analyst in particular that this is a rigorous piece of work. To be honest, most of the time they will see it's coming from somebody based in a university. It's reasonably safe to assume it's rigorous. You want to tell them about the approach that you've taken, because that's often of interest. It's perhaps worth mentioning here that the Scottish government is much more pluralistic in its approach to the sorts of studies that it is interested in than the UK government is, and that certain other governments are. So the Scottish government, of course, likes large randomized controlled trials, but it's not obsessed with them. So it is also interested in qualitative research. It's also interested in often some quite radical approaches to research. It's interested in discovering what you can find out through new methods in a way that some other governments aren't necessarily. So be aware of that. Don't obfuscate what your methodology is, but be aware of the purpose of stating it. You're demonstrating that there is a methodology there. That's reassuring for your reader. Then you get into the results. This is where thinking in terms of what is it that you need to say is important. So you're not necessarily giving an exhaustive overview of what you found. You're selecting the results that you think speak most germanely to that particular question. Now, you want to take the readers through this, relatively quickly, but step by step, and so when you're into an editing process of this document, it's good to work with people who are unfamiliar with it and say, do you see how that finding follows on from that? Does this read in a sensible and reasonable way to you? Is your mind instinctively reaching out for the next point that I'm making, and then that next point is answering the question that you're instinctively asking. So the other big bit of a policy brief are the implications and recommendations, and this is what distinguishes a policy brief from just an evidence brief. So in this, you're actually making recommendations about policy, or you're stating implications for the real world. Now, one thing I should mention here is if you are producing a policy brief based on a particular piece of research, check the guidelines from the funder of that research. Some funders can be a bit funny about you making policy recommendations. That's fine. You can set out the evidence and let the reader draw their own conclusions. And in fact, there is a skill to setting out evidence in a way that makes those conclusions easy to reach. I mean, I won't say you force the hand of your reader. I don't think you need to. But for example, one study I encountered recently they had been looking at types of transport and public health, and the conclusion was that easier access to cycle paths and walkways were good for public health. Not a terribly surprising conclusion, perhaps. The policy recommendation was that therefore local authorities should build more of those. Now, I would say in a policy brief, it is a good idea to make that explicit, to draw that conclusion. But you could not draw that conclusion, and it would still be pretty obvious to the reader what the evidence suggested in terms of that particular decision. I mean, sometimes things aren't that clear cut, but I think it's a helpful indication. And then just 10%. So again, I mean, in 2 pages, you're talking about a paragraph that size on references and further resources. Again, it doesn't need to be exhaustive. Again, you go back to that question of, does it help the reader understand? So you might put there some of the works that helped you in that study, because that might be of use and interest. It might help the reader say, yeah, okay, this is authoritative, this sits within the main body of academic opinion on this particular topic, or this is new, this is a different way of approaching a problem. You might also put in there links to websites giving more detail on the research that's been conducted. You might put in links to, if it's come out of a particular center, links to that center, to the biographies of the team, those kind of things. So you put in there some references, some further resources, but again, as with everything else, put it through that filter of, does this help the reader understand? Yeah, this isn't an academic publication where you might put in an entire bibliography and it would be quite a substantive part of the whole document. This is just, we're putting something here to be useful, perhaps to be reassuring, but that's the purpose of the exercise. So again, everything that goes in, you think about in terms of how does this work for this particular tool, for what I'm trying to achieve, rather than necessarily saying, okay, well, this is going to go through peer review, people are going to try and tear it apart, so I have to put everything in and cover every crack. The nature of the exercise is different here. So that's all I want to talk about. Before I take questions, I want to show you, these are actually a couple of evidence briefs, but the structure is different, but I think they're quite illustrative. I want to show you these, as I say, these are evidence briefs, so they're a bit different. But just to give you a sense of how, they're not setting it out in a terribly formal way. They're making it very clear to whoever's reading this what the points are that they're making. Yeah, and just a very short reference and resource section there at the end. Now, that's a different structure from the one I just gave you. It sets out information very clearly. It ticks all of those boxes, so you can treat those things of, okay, do I talk about the results? Do I talk about sources of further information? You can treat that as a tick list if you like. You don't need to have those headings on the page. That's the content that you're putting in. This one is quite nice. It must have been something else I was looking at. Let me just see if I can find it. I'll maybe look through later on in the session. There was another one, a brief I was looking at last night, that just had this tiny box on the side of the front page that just said brief in brief. Yeah, and it was the whole brief boiled down to 3 very short bullet points. And I thought that was great. If you're trying to convey that, you've already compressed it down to 2 pages, and it's like, okay, how can we choose the 3 bullet points? All right, we'll decide. And it was just sitting there. And again, quite creative use of design, not not thinking about this is a formal report style, but thinking about how can I grab somebody's attention. It's really worth, if you have the opportunity, it's really worth sitting and talking to some designers about problems like this. We tend to forget that design isn't an exercise in making things pretty. It's an exercise in making things work, and designers will often have really creative ways of solving some of these problems and saving you precious space, allowing you to convey these ideas much more quickly.